Good morning. It's Sister Teresa in the gardens again. We have another beautiful morning. Autumn is coming in, and I think tomorrow's the first day of autumn. So I just want to welcome autumn here. It's been such a nice break from the heat that we had this summer, although it was not really that hot this summer. We're going to continue our study in Daniel today. We're in Daniel chapters 5 and 6. We got some really exciting stories, and I hope that you enjoy them. You know, in our world, everything is changing so much, it's hard to find something that stays the same. This book and the Word of God stays the same. It's something that we can count on all the time. It's our rock that we can go to, that nothing shakes us when we're standing on that rock. And that's what we're going to learn about today with Daniel. The story starts with a king called Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar is a lot like the name that King Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel, Belteshazzar with a T. But we're going to be talking about a king called Belshazzar today. And he was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And he didn't follow what Nebuchadnezzar had established in the last part of his life. Remember the last part of the story last week, Nebuchadnezzar had turned his whole life over to God. And he was serving God. And he said if anybody said anything bad about Daniel's God, they would be torn limb from limb and their houses be made into rubble. And so the last part of his kingdom reign, he served God. And he was a good king. And then he had a son, and then that son got killed, and several other people were in between Belshazzar. But Belshazzar wasn't ruling like his grandfather had ruled. And he actually is having a feast where everybody is getting drunk. It's a feast for his God. And this feast had been prophesied about by Isaiah and Jeremiah. Jeremiah 50 years before, and Isaiah 150 years before. God really wanted this kingdom of Babylon to turn and serve him and to know what would happen if they didn't. We always have consequences when we don't serve God, because when we're serving him and we're being obedient to him, he makes sure that we're protected and we're taken care of. But if we don't do what he says to do, he does allow consequences to happen in our lives to steer us back to the place where we are obeying him. And sometimes people get a chance to get back on track, and sometimes people don't. We're going to learn about a king called Belshazzar that had been given his last chance, and he failed miserably. So King Belshazzar was giving a feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver cups that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem when he captured it. He wanted to drink from them with all of his nobles and his wives and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple of the house of the God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And while they drank from them, they praised their idols of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone, all those things that could not talk, could not see, could not save them from anything. This temple was huge. It was like very, very huge. When I say huge, it was like 10 miles long. That is a really big temple. Well, maybe it wasn't 10 miles long, but it was a huge place. And there were idols all along the walls of all these gods of iron and wood and stone and bronze. And so they were taking these holy cups that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem, used for worshiping God, and they were using them to worship their gods. Remember, they got drunk with their gods, and they had big orgies in their feasting festivals, and that's what was taking place here. So they were actually was called desecrating. It was, they were doing a very bad thing with holy, holy things of God. So, suddenly, they saw fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. So it could be seen very easily. The king himself saw it as it wrote, and his face turned pale, and he got scared, and his knees knocked together with fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. Some scriptures said that he peed himself, and other scriptures say that he pooped himself. He lost total control. Now, I don't know if that's ever happened to you. I don't know if you've ever been scared that bad before, but this is what scripture says. He was that scared. And you know, there's several times that God has used his own finger to write things. Remember when he gave Moses the 10 Commandments? It says he wrote them out in stone with his own finger. And for those of you that know a little bit more, when Jesus had a lady brought before him that had been caught in adultery and everyone was wanting to stone her, he knelt down and started writing with his finger in the dirt, thinking about what he was going to say to all of them. When Jesus does something, it's just as if God did something, because Jesus is God's son, remember? Okay, so let's get back to our story that happened 1,000 years before, maybe 2,000 years before Jesus came. So it says the king shouted for the enchanters and the astrologers and the fortune tellers to be brought before him. He said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be dressed in a purple robe of royal honor and will have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." When someone had a purple robe put on them, that meant they were being treated like royalty. And you know what gold chains around the neck means? It means that you got some money. Well, here, if you had a gold chain around your neck, it meant the same thing. It meant you had wealth. And King Belshazzar was a ruling king, but he was ruling as a co-regency with his father. And his father didn't like things about ruling the kingdom. And so his father liked battle, and his father liked conquest. So his father had all the troops outside the city gates of Babylon. Now these gates, there was 2 huge walls that surrounded Babylon, and one of them was wide enough that 2 chariots could have races on top of them. And there was a moat in between. So outside the temple, outside the gates of the city, were the Medes and the Persians. Now these were 2 nations that have come together to try to wipe out Babylon. And they had 2 rulers, and they were related. One was father and one was son-in-law. And so these 2 nations had joined together, and they had come to make a siege outside of Jerusalem. And I'm not real sure how to say his name. Started with an N. He was outside the city walls, and that was Belshazzar's father. He was outside the city walls fighting these people. And he actually left the battle and took off. He went to a place that he never came back to Babylon from. He was actually captured by King Cyrus, and I guess he made him stay there. I don't know. But our story gets back here where the king is shouting for the astrologers because he wants to know what this writing on the wall means. And you know, he's inside the walls of Babylon having a big feast. He's not a bit afraid of the Medes and the Persians having a siege outside the walls, because he feels very well protected inside these walls. Nobody has ever penetrated the walls of Babylon before, and they had the Euphrates River running right through the city. It came in one gate and it went out in another gate. So they had plenty of water. When somebody besieged a city, the purpose was to starve them out. And if they didn't have enough water or didn't have enough food inside, they did starve and they would surrender. And that way the people outside that was trying to overcome that city could take them without even fighting, because they would be too weak to fight. But the Babylonians were smart, and they had a huge 10-city block, or 10 miles, that's what it was, on the inside of the city. That's where I got the 10 miles from. They were on the inside of the city, and they could grow crops in there, and they had food stored up for at least 20 years. So Belshazzar, he wasn't worried at all. So he's calling for all of his wise men to come and tell him what the writing means. But when the wise men came in, none of them could read the writing or tell him what it meant. And the king grew even more scared, and his face turned really pale, and he didn't know what to do. And all of his nobles were really shaken too. Well, his grandmother came in to tell him what to do. How many of you have ever had a family situation where a grandmother or a grandfather came in and said, I know just what to do? And that's what happened here. King Nebuchadnezzar's wife was still alive, and that was Belshazzar's grandmother. And she came in and said, O king, don't be afraid. Long live the king. Here is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insights, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your grandfather made him chief over all the magicians, astrologers, and enchanters and fortune tellers. This man's name is Daniel, and he has exceptional ability, and he has divine knowledge and understanding, and he can interpret dreams. Remember when Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream? When King Nebuchadnezzar didn't even remember what it was? He can solve difficult problems. Call for him, and he will tell you what the writing means. And so Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king asked him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar? I have heard that you have the Spirit of God within you, and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. But I am told that you can give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor, and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Daniel said, You know what? Just keep your gifts. I don't need them. But I will tell you what the interpretation means. You, king, are a king, but your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar was given majesty. The Most High God gave him sovereignty, glory, and honor. He made him so great that people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. He killed those he wanted to kill. He spared those he wanted to spare. He honored those he wanted to honor, and he disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. But when his heart and mind were purified, when they were puffed up with arrogance, and he's trying to get a message through to Belshazzar that his heart is puffed up with pride and arrogance too, to have the gall to go get these holy things out of the place where they were being stored and bring them and start using them to worship their gods with, that was a very prideful thing to do. So Daniel is telling Belshazzar, when your grandfather's heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, he was brought down from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven from human society. Remember this? He was given the mind of a wild animal, and he lived among the wild donkeys. He ate grass like a cow and was drenched with dew of heaven until he learned that the Most High God is the one that rules over the kingdoms, not him. And he appoints anyone he desires to rule over them. You are your grandfather's successor, Belshazzar, and you knew all about this. Yet you have not humbled yourself before the living God. You have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from the temple brought before you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them and praising your gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. But you have never honored the God who gives you the breath of life, who controls your destiny. So God has sent his own very hand to give you this message. And this is the message that's written on the wall. You see, this message was written in Aramaic. And the Aramaic have words that have two different meanings, like our English language does. The word saw can mean a saw that you cut things, or it can mean that you saw something with your eyes. And so these wise men were very puzzled because they couldn't get the words in the right sequence. But Daniel knew what these words mean because he had studied Aramaic. But even more than that, he had studied Jeremiah and Isaiah and other prophets that had told, remember, about this very night that Belshazzar would have a drunken feast. And Daniel knew from his study of Jeremiah and Isaiah that during that feast that the enemy was going to come in, and it was specifically the Medes and the Persians, because God had named them in the writings of Isaiah and in the writings of Jeremiah, and said that they were going to come in. And in one night, before the people that were having the drunken feast even knew that the city had been taken, a messenger was going to come in and say, the city's been taken by the Medes and the Persians. And Jeremiah's writing and Isaiah's writing said how it was going to be taken out. You see, that Euphrates River that was running through the city, the Medes and the Persians, about a mile up the way, had dammed up the Euphrates River and diverted it to go into a pool of water. And so the level of the Euphrates had started going down. And these gates that were there, that the river ran under, there were grates like that underneath the gates that wouldn't let like limbs and stuff flow into the city. And so if somebody tried to swim underneath the gates, they couldn't get underneath it because this Euphrates River was very, very deep. And the grates underneath would keep anybody from going so far down that they could swim underneath. But because the river was dammed up upstream, the level of the Euphrates River started going down, 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 down. And these men were having a drunken feast, and they didn't realize it. And even Isaiah talks about these gates underneath the upper gates being unlocked because nobody thought that anyone would be able to come underneath them. But as the river came down, the Medes and the Persians were able to crawl underneath the grates and get into the city and start taking the city out. And Isaiah even talks about the people that are coming in to take out the city of Babylon would creep in like caterpillars. Man, isn't that amazing that God had that written down? And the book of Jeremiah was given to Zedekiah and Zedekiah's son, and they were to go in. Jeremiah told them to go into Babylon and tell them what was going to happen to them and warn them, much like Jonah went into Nineveh, and then Nineveh repented because God was hoping that they would repent and change their ways. But they didn't. And so when they came in and they read this scroll, Jeremiah said, after you read this scroll, you seal it and roll it up and you throw it in the Euphrates River. Put a stone around it so it will sink. This is the very river that was used to take out Babylon. And God wrote about it 50 years before and 150 years before through Jeremiah and Isaiah. And like I said, Daniel was studying the book of Jeremiah, the very book that we read a couple of weeks ago. And he was studying Isaiah, also the very book that we studied a couple of weeks ago. And now here we are in Daniel. So, Daniel was brought in before the king. And he said, this is what the writing on the wall means. It was Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. Mene means numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign, King Belshazzar, and brought it to an end. Wonder how Belshazzar felt when he was saying these things. Tekel means weighed. You have been weighed in the balances, and you have not measured up. When they would weigh out things in biblical days, they had a scale, and it had chains down on 2 pieces of plates. And they would put something on one side and put something on the other side, and they would weigh them to see how they measured up. And if things were even, they were even, and they measured equally. Well, God was telling Belshazzar, I have weighed you. I've put you in the scales and weighed you, and you have not measured up. Has anyone ever said to you, nope, that's not good enough, you got to do it over again? Well, that's what God was saying to Belshazzar, but he wasn't going to give Belshazzar another chance. So, Mene means numbered, your days are numbered. Tekel means weighed, and Parsin means divided. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, Daniel is saying this, and it's in the process of happening right now. As Daniel is saying this, he's saying the Medes and the Persians are going to take over your land. It's going to be divided between the two of you. The Medes and the Persians, remember, son and father-in-law, or son-in-law and father-in-law. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel, even though the news that he brought Belshazzar was bad news, he followed through with what he said. So I guess he was honorable in that way. And he dressed Daniel in purple robes and put a gold chain around his neck, and he was proclaimed 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. His father, Nebuchadnezzar, that's his name, Nebuchadnezzar. His father was 1st commander in Babylon. Belshazzar was 2nd commander, and now Daniel was being made 3rd commander. That's something we need to remember, because here in a minute we're going to talk about it. Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So the Medes and the Persians crawled in. They slaughtered all the nobles and wise men that Daniel had brought in, that not Daniel, but Belshazzar had brought in. And Belshazzar was killed that very night. So God's predictions that he had talked about in Jeremiah and Isaiah came true. Isn't that always the way? They always come true. So, Darius the Mede took over. Cyrus was off fighting other battles, and Darius the Mede ruled for 2 years in Babylon. And you know, he and Daniel became great friends. Remember, Daniel was the only ruler in the kingdom at this time. Did you see that bee go by just then? That was a huge bumblebee. It was red, it was yellow and black. It was very big. I'm not afraid of bumblebees. They won't sting you. Honeybees won't sting you either, unless you make them mad. So, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces. And so he had 120 men that he put as governors over these provinces. They called them satraps instead of governors. And he appointed 3 men to be rulers over those 120 governors of the provinces. And Daniel and 2 other men were those 3 men that were appointed. And King Darius liked Daniel so much, he had decided that he was going to make Daniel head over the other 2 men. And that meant that he was going to be second in command. Well, all these other men didn't like it. These other 2 men didn't like it. They were administrators with Daniel. But they didn't like the fact that someone who was a Hebrew was going to be over them. Someone who was a captive, actually. Daniel and all the people that were Israeli were still captors. Even though another kingdom had taken over Babylon, they were still slaves. They were still captives. But King Darius really liked Daniel, and he was going to put him second in command. Remember when I was talking about Nebuchadnezzar being first in command and his son Belshazzar being second in command, and then Daniel being third in command? Well, now Daniel was the only one that was left from the Babylonian rule, and so Darius was going to make him second in command under him. I don't know if you remember the story about Joseph when Pharaoh made him second in command. It's a very high honor. So, these two other administrators and all the wise astrologers and enchanters and magicians, they didn't like this. So they were trying to come up with a plan to get Daniel kicked out. And they started investigating Daniel. There's a lot of people that get investigated that are high officials in offices here in America. And when somebody wants to put them down or kick them out of office, they try to dig up some dirt on them, something that they did in their life before they became in leadership that would say, well, this man's not worthy of being in leadership. We see this happening even right now in the election that's coming up. Both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, are trying to get bad things on the other and to talk about each other in bad ways. And that's not a good thing to do. I don't know if you're trying to get somebody to like you or accept you or have favor of you, but if you start doing it by putting other people down, that's not a good thing. If you're weighed in the balances like Belshazzar was, and you come out good, then you're good. You don't have to worry about putting somebody else down to prove that you're good. Your works will speak for you. Just remember that, okay? Let's play fair. God wants us to be good, be just, and love mercy. Remember to be kind to people. So they were searching around for some fault in the way Daniel was handling the government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn him. Daniel was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. King Darius didn't have to worry about Daniel taking money, which is called embezzling. These other men did, and they did not want Daniel over them because they knew if Daniel was over them, Daniel would run a tight ship, and he would make sure that everything was done on the up and up and fairly. And they wouldn't be able to get away with skimming things off the top and doing things in an untrustworthy way. So they didn't want him over them, but they couldn't find anything. So they concluded the only way that they were going to be able to trick Daniel and take him out was to use his religion that he was so faithful to. Daniel prayed 3 times a day to God because that's what Hebrew men were supposed to do, morning, noon, and night. They were supposed to turn to the direction of Jerusalem, even if they weren't in Jerusalem. If they were in Jerusalem, they needed to go to the temple and pray. But oh my goodness, remember? Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the temple the 3rd time he came in and invaded Jerusalem. He had totally destroyed the temple. That's how the temple holy cups and utensils and lampstands and showbread table and incense table and all of that, that's how it was in Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar tore the temple down, tore the city down. He took all the holy things out and actually put them in the temple of his own God. And that's when Belshazzar said, bring them out so we can drink from them. We want to get drunk and worship our God with those things. We want to put down the Hebrew people. Well, Darius didn't want the Hebrew people put down. He was actually lifting them up. And God had favored Daniel so much that even in captivity, he was lifted up constantly by King Nebuchadnezzar and now by Darius. We're going to find out later by King Cyrus as well. God was giving people in leadership favor with Daniel, giving Daniel favor with these people because Daniel was a faithful man. So these government officials, they decided that they were going to go to King Darius. They knew that Daniel worshiped his God. Oh, one more tidbit of information. Remember when King David's son Solomon built the temple? He prayed a prayer when he was dedicating the temple, and he asked God a favor, and God granted it. And that favor was that if ever God's people were not in the city of Jerusalem, and they prayed just facing Jerusalem, that God would grant their prayer. And you know, I believe that God laid that on Solomon's heart because God knew ahead of time he was going to let his people go into captivity. Remember, they were there for a time out because they had been worshiping idols. And God tried to tell them to stop doing it, and they wouldn't stop doing it. So God had them taken into captivity. Some of them were captured by the Assyrians and dispersed. They never ever got to go back to Jerusalem. But God was keeping a certain part of them alive because he was going to bring Jesus through their bloodline. And so he had them taken into captivity in Babylon, and that's where they were right now. Daniel was one of the first ones taken in captivity. And so he was there longer than a lot of the others. And when the others came in, he was a familiar face. And he learned the language. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar had the strong men that were sons of the nobles to be taught the language and to be taught the customs so that they can teach the others. I've got a little hummingbird that's coming here and looking at me doing this right now. He's so sweet. Maybe he'll get behind the camera so that you can see him too. He was wondering what I was doing. I am sharing Daniel with you. So let's get back to our story. It's so easy when I'm in the gardens to see things. I'm trying to stay focused so I can tell you the story. So Solomon had prayed this prayer, and he was asking for God to hear the prayers of his people, even if they weren't in Jerusalem, if they would just turn towards Jerusalem. So 3 times a day, Daniel would go to his house, open the window that faced Jerusalem, and he would pray to God. He would ask God to get them out of captivity. He would thank God for taking care of them. He would have fellowship and communion with God 3 times a day. And these administrators knew it. And so they decided they were going to make an evil plot. They were going to go to King Darius and trick him. They were going to flatter him. And this is what they said. "Oh, King Darius, you are a mighty, mighty king. And we want everyone to know that you're a mighty king. And we want everyone to get in the habit of coming to you when they need advice, not going to the gods that they worship. So we're going to tell you that we think it's a good idea for you to make a decree that for the next 30 days, anytime anyone prayed to anything, it was to pray to you. You're going to be treated like a god for 30 days. And then the people will accept you, and they will be in the habit of turning to you when they need something. And that way you will be more in control." And Darius is going, "Yeah, it sounds like a good plan. You know, when somebody does something for 30 days, it becomes a habit. And I want to get to know these people. And I would like for them to come before me when they need something. So, yeah, I'll do that. I'll sign the decree." Well, these men already had it written out, and they went, "Here, just sign on the dotted line." A lot of people get tricked by doing that very thing, and they sign contracts that they're then bound to hold out. They buy things. They sign their name on the dotted line, and they buy things that they really didn't need anyway. And so this King Darius really didn't need to do this. If he was an honorable king, God would lift him up and give him favor with the people that he was ruling over. But King Darius didn't pray about it to God. He just did it on his own. That's why anytime we're going to sign a contract or say we're going to do something, we need to take that thought captive before God the Father and ask if it's something that's truly good for us. So here we are. King Darius signs the decree, and off these men go to watch Daniel. And the first time that he went up in his house, opened his windows and started praying to his God, they were going to go back and tell the king, tattle on him, nana nana boo boo, do you know what you do is against the decree? Well, Daniel heard about this decree, but he wasn't going to let that stop him from worshiping his God the same way he always had. He knew what his consequence was going to be. Oh, I forgot to tell you, part of the decree said that if anyone worshiped another god during those 30 days or prayed to another god during those 30 days, they would be thrown into a den of hungry lions. And it's not like lions in a cage at the zoo. This was a platform that had a hole, and underneath in a cavern there were lions that got fed, barely enough to keep them alive. And when somebody was going to be punished with death, they were going to be executed, they would be thrown into this pit of hungry lions. And these hungry lions would just gobble them up before anything because they were so hungry. They were kept hungry for that purpose. These men wanted Daniel taken out, and they couldn't trap him with something that he had done wrong. So they trapped him by getting King Darius to sign a decree that said no one could pray to their gods for 30 days. No one could pray to anyone except King Darius. This is not a very good thing to do. I don't know if you have ever plotted against your brothers or your sisters or somebody else trying to trap them. That's called manipulation. And Bible says manipulation is as witchcraft. So it's not a good thing to do. So if you've ever done that, you need to ask God to forgive you. Or if you're in the process of doing it right now, you need to stop and ask God to forgive you. That is not the way to get things brought about. If you want something or you need something, you pray and ask God for it. And He will bring it about if it's something that's truly good. And if it's not, He'll protect you from it, which is a very good thing. So, when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went ahead and did what he always did. He prayed to his God. And, oh, by the way, Daniel was not a young man. When I was growing up, the pictures I saw of Daniel being thrown into a lion's den, oh, I just gave it away, didn't I? He's going to be thrown in a lion's den for praying to his God. But I always saw it as a young man being thrown in. He was not a young man. He was in his 80s. I'm in my 60s. I'm 66. So Daniel was in his 80s when this happened. That's 20 years more than I am right now. So I think he was an old man. So these men, when they saw Daniel giving thanks like he's always done to his God, they went together to the king, and first they reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, would be thrown into a den of lions? The king said, yes, that decision stands. It is now an official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar could make a law and then he could change that law. That's why he was the gold head on that statue that he had a dream about. He had the most power and the most authority of any of the other kingdoms that were in the statue below him. The Medes and the Persians didn't have that ability to change a law they had made. And King Darius knew that. And that's why he said, it is now an official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law, and he's still praying to his God 3 times a day. And hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. He loved Daniel, and he spent the whole rest of the day trying to figure out how he could make it different, where Daniel would not be thrown into the lion's den. But he couldn't come up with an idea. In the end of the day, these men came back to him and said, hey, sundown's coming, and you know that we have another law of the Medes and the Persians, that whenever a decree was ignored or something was done opposite of decree, the punishment had to happen before sunset. Sun's going down, O king, what you going to do? So the king didn't have any other way to do things but to have Daniel called in. And we're not told that Daniel protested or that Daniel said, oh, no, 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 no. Daniel knew. Remember? He knew what the consequence was going to be for obeying his God. And he was not going to bow down to King Darius or any other king. Just like his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, wouldn't bow down to the statue that Nebuchadnezzar made. And remember, they were thrown into a fiery furnace, but God protected them. And they weren't even smelling like smoke when they came out of it. Well, hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. And in the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. And the king walked with him to this opening of the den. And he said, The God whom you serve so faithfully will serve you. Wonder how King Darius knew that. You know, in the 2 years that King Darius had been on the throne and he and Daniel had become great friends, I'm sure that Daniel had been sharing how wonderful his God was and how faithful he was to his God. And King Darius knew enough about Daniel's God to know that he would save him. And he was trusting that that would happen. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den of the lions. And King Darius had to use his own signet ring and seal that stone sealed shut. And the other men came and used their signet rings and sealed it shut either. Maybe they didn't trust King Darius to sneak Daniel out during the night. But all these seals were put on this stone so that it would be proven that Daniel was thrown in there and stayed in there. And the king went back to his house. And he didn't do what he normally did at night. He normally had feasting and he ate food and had dancers come before him. And he didn't do that. He went into his room and he didn't even sleep. He prayed all night long that Daniel's God would save him. You know, he didn't say, my God, when he was taking Daniel to the lion's den. He said, your God, Daniel, will save you and be faithful to you because you faithfully serve him. But King Darius believed that Daniel's God would save him, and he fasted, and he prayed all night long. And in the morning, as soon as the sun came up, just like the sun is coming up right here and shining down on my face, as soon as the sun came up, he ran to the lion's den, and he called out, and he said, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lion's den? And Daniel called out, long live the king! My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in God's sight, and I have still not wronged you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed, and he ordered Daniel be lifted up from the den, and not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. You know, that's a very good thing that Daniel did. That's a very faithful thing that Daniel did. In the end times, it says that people are going to be killed and beheaded because they're not going to renounce Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior when the enemy is ruling everything and he's demanding that people worship him. There's going to be people on the earth still at that time that are converting and that are believing that God sent his son Jesus to die and pay for their sins and accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior. Those that had when Jesus comes back are going to be with him, waiting for the time that they come and totally take Satan out. The first part of Daniel, the first 6 chapters, talk about what happened in Daniel's life, and it gives us stories of Daniel. The other 6 chapters that we're going to be starting next week tell more about those end times. It's very hard to read Daniel without reading the last book of the New Testament, Revelation, because they go so hand in hand. Daniel was given lots of visions about those end times that we're going to be learning about in the next couple of weeks. But Darius is so angry with these men that tricked him, because he knew they tricked him after they ran in and was trying to take Daniel out. He was a smart man, and he knew that they were just trying to get Daniel out of the way, and he loved Daniel. So King Darius had those administrators and those high officials and all their wives and all their children thrown in the lion's den. And Scripture says that before their bodies even hit the bottom of the den, that the lions had devoured them. You see, they were trying to tell the king, oh, you must have fed the lions up really fat so that they wouldn't touch Daniel. And there's a man named Josephus that was a historical writer that wrote about 70 years after Jesus died. And he wrote down a lot of things that had happened. He was a historian. And he wrote that these administrators had said to King Darius, you must have fed the lions, and that's why they didn't feed him. So why they didn't eat him. And so King Darius, according to Josephus, had a whole bunch of fresh meat put in the lion's den to make sure that the lions were very, very full. And then he had the officials thrown in to prove to everybody that even though the lions were fat, that it was truly God's hand that had saved Daniel, and not because the lions just weren't hungry. So God has a way of showing us that his word is true. And predictions and prophecies from prophets is one of those ways. So we're going to get together next week again to learn about those visions that God gave Daniel, that he wrote down, so we can know more about what is going to happen and we can be more prepared. I love you. And I hope that you have enjoyed these stories today. Some of you may have heard them before, but maybe didn't have some of the background information. We're going to learn more next week. Until then, be good. Love to do right. Be fair and be kind to everyone. Bye-bye.